Hello all, Rambling Canuck. Today's video is going to be a little different, so I hope you'll indulge me. It's not about Star Trek, Star Wars, wrestling, karaoke. It's kind of a trip down memory lane, my memory lane. And some may say that I shouldn't make these kind of videos because they're not going to get a lot of traction, yada, yada, yada. I don't care. I feel like I need to talk about it. And I consider most of you all family. So, here we go. We're going to go back 19 years. 38 on Friday. So I was 19. Well, just turning 19. And on this day, 19 years ago, my father, Arthur Frederick Knowles, was in Riverview Health Center. His lung cancer had pretty much taken over. But he was still up and about at this point. And we were getting conflicting reports from the doctors at this point. He might turn out of it, probably won't. He's probably not leaving the Riverview Health Center. And tomorrow, the 21st, would be the last day my father would be up and about. He spent that day with his granddaughter. At the time, my only daughter, my only child. And he joked around with her. You could barely tell he was sick. I mean, there were some obvious things, his oxygen tank and other things. But other than that, same old dad, same old grandpa. He spent the entire day with her. Insisted on it. And spoiled her rotten, as normal. But he spent the entire day with her. And it was encouraging. In fact, we started to think that Dad was going to pull his old trick, which was have every doctor tell us that he was not going to make it, and then take a laugh, say, hold my beer, and a couple of weeks later, Dad would be up and about and back at home. He'd done this a few times. However, that was not to be the case this time. The 22nd came around, and because Dad had been kind of okay for the most part, I went to work. For those who don't know, 22nd is also my birthday, so I just turned 19. So I went to work that day. It was power rake season, so it was a long day. And I got off work and I went to the hospital, which is my routine by now. Get off work, drive to the hospital, check on Dad, take Dad out for a cigarette, yada, yada, yada. Because at this point, Dad needed somebody with him to go for a smoke. So I knew to get my butt to the hospital because Dad was probably itching for a cigarette by now. So I get into the hospital and they're greeting me at the door, informing me that Dad has been in and out of it all day. Hasn't really moved. Most of what he said that day didn't make any sense. And Dad did not end up going for that cigarette. I went for many. That was the last day my dad was conscious. That night, Dad slipped into a coma. And for the next 3 days, my dad stayed in a comatose state. I made the call into work that I would not be there for the next couple of days because up until now I had felt that I could still go to work, and Dad was okay enough. Well, things had changed. So I spent my 19th birthday in the hospital on a cot next to my father. I'd go home to shower and change clothes. I'd go back to the hospital. I did this for 3 more days. And it was so jarring because the day before, Dad was up and about. Dad had his cigarettes. Dad made jokes. Dad laughed, joked around, held his granddaughter. And now today, on the 22nd, he's completely delusional. And then the 23rd, he was completely unresponsive. He'd squeeze my hand from time to time, but for the most part, unresponsive. Family would come in and out, my brother, etc. And I had to make some hard choices at that point. I was the youngest son, but for most part, decisions were made through me. Whether they were all the right ones is debatable. Then came, I think, the hardest thing I ever had to do in my life. One of the hardest. Can't say the hardest. There's been a few. But one of the hardest things was the second night, about midnight, 12:30. Riverview Health Center has a little courtyard. There's some park benches and stuff. And this was the second night of Dad being a complete comatose. Absolute complete comatose. It was a Thursday night. And 12:30, roughly, give or take. It's been 19 years. I was out having my cigarette. And I do say cigarettes, not cigarette. And, in a way, looking back, I wonder if anybody was looking out their window going, what is that crazy person doing? Because at that point, I fell to my knees in the middle of this courtyard on the grass. And I yelled at the top of my lungs with my hands raised in the air, just take him home already. And I proceeded to do this for the next half an hour. Slam my fist to the ground and I just yelled, take him home. He's done. It's enough. And I think that's the hardest prayer I ever prayed. And up until that point, I really hadn't gotten back to praying or reading the Bible or anything like that since my mom had died. So praying wasn't in my regular vocabulary. I mean, I still would from time to time, but it wasn't an everyday thing. And I just remember falling to my knees and crying out over and over again, just take him home. I could just imagine people looking out their window and seeing this teenager slamming his fist into the dirt and talking incoherently. Half angry, half upset. Absolute mess. Probably thinking I was on something or drunk or something. But that memory sticks in my brain because it really is one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. Because I didn't want my dad to go. I was still young. My mom had left at 12. So losing my dad was not sitting well with me. But at that point, I felt that dad had served his time. He'd done enough. I didn't pray for healing. I didn't pray for him to be better. Maybe that was wrong of me. But in the moment, after I was done hitting the ground, I had another cigarette or two. And I kept kind of saying it over and over again, even when I was walking. Just take him. He's done. I guess some of my fellow Christians might look down on me and say, you should have been praying for his good health. You should have been praying for healing. You should have been speaking life to him. Let me tell you something. That man at that point had lived through more pain and suffering than I ever want to think about. We're talking about a man who went through 2 triple bypasses. People are lucky to survive 1. Dad survived 2. The man looked like a jigsaw puzzle. The cut from here that went all the way down to his ankle, from where they had extracted veins to put into his heart. He'd already survived lung cancer once, had half a lung removed. Broke his hip. Had countless strokes, countless heart attacks. So in my weird, warped sense of, I guess, understanding at the time, I felt that him going was easier, was more of a peaceful release than healing him and making him endure it more. Because his lung cancer wasn't, there was nothing they could do with it. They couldn't operate. They couldn't treat it with chemo. He wasn't healthy enough. So they just jacked him full of morphine. And Dad jacked himself full of his beer of choice. I say jacked, but I mean, he had his 2 liters a day or so. And that helped him cope. Some may look down on him even still because why is he drinking? It helped him cope. Right or wrong, it helped him cope. So I never stood against that. But that night, on the grass, when I hit my knees, and I prayed with everything in me, just take him home. It was me letting go. You know, I sit here 19 years later, and I still miss him. He's my dad. Well, at 11:30 a.m. the next morning, my prayer was answered. My father breathed his last, and I became Mr. Knowles. Because up until that point, I refused to allow anyone to call me Mr. Knowles, because Mr. Knowles was at home, or Mr. Knowles was sitting over there, or Mr. Knowles was my father. I was Robert. And there's a story with that. Shortly after my dad died, and I was sitting at home, I was talking with one of my friends, and it really hadn't hit really hard. I hadn't really cried yet. I cried a little bit when Dad first died, when I found out, when they woke me up. I was laying next to him. But I had pushed it down, and I hadn't really let it out yet again. Until my friend looked at me and says, "Well, I guess that makes you Mr. Knowles now, doesn't it?" And that hit harder than anything else that had happened over the last 48 hours. Just coming to that realization that I was now Mr. Knowles. I guess it's silly for me to sit here and tell this story, but I really think it needs to be told. My father was this very strong man. And I don't mean strong that he could lift 400 pounds and pull a Volkswagen. My dad was raised in a generation where sympathy was a word in a dictionary, and it was frowned upon. I'll give you an idea. There's a story that I always remember about my dad, kind of give you an idea of the man who raised me. We got word that my dad's brother had passed away in Saskatchewan. And my dad's brother's wife also passed away the same weekend. So they were having a double funeral. And being the son and the licensed driver, my dad asked if I could get the time off work to drive him out to the funeral. And of course, I made those arrangements. And we're sitting in the church, and both caskets are up front, and Dad is sitting there. And now, mind you, we're at his brother's funeral. Just want to bring that up again. And one of his family members are up at the pulpit, and they're talking about stories from Darlingford, where my dad grew up. And all of a sudden, my dad starts to cry. Visibly cry. Not standing up, sitting up straight, and a tear rolling down, but visibly crying. And of course, being the son that I am, I reached over and I held my dad. And all my father could say was, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry I'm crying." To this day, that blows my mind. He was at his brother's funeral. And my father felt he had to apologize to his son for crying in public. We look upon it now as normal. It's fine. Even then, I would never judge my father for that. But I mean, the amount of times that I've seen my father outright cry in a public place, I could probably count on this hand. This is a man that I watched the doctors tell him that there's absolutely nothing they could do about it. Him laugh and go, "Okay, well, thanks. Can I go for a smoke yet?" And that's a true story. But my father visibly crying at his brother's funeral. My father felt he had to apologize. I, of course, told him he didn't, and that was silly. But to my dad, it was all too real. It was serious. He couldn't believe that he allowed himself to cry in public. So maybe when you're around people that are a little older than you and they cry, and you might think it's trivial, maybe take a couple seconds before you laugh about it or poke fun. Because if they're anything like my dad, crying in public was not allowed, not permitted. And for them to be doing so, that's a big thing. Just a side note. But I don't want this to all be sad things. You know, I look back now, and for the first couple of years after my dad died, my birthday was off limits. It's really sad to say now, but I didn't celebrate my birthday till I was 22. I think was the first time I had a real big birthday party. I might have gone through the motions a couple of times, but I never really celebrated it for a good time after that, because my dad's memory overshadowed it. And now we're 19 years later, and my dad's anniversary still hangs over that day, that week, the weekend. And there's a lot of memories that flood back, mainly about that week. All the family turmoil and bullshit. Decisions I made that I maybe shouldn't have. A little too harsh. Maybe things I wouldn't have done with hindsight. But that prayer, I never regret. I never regret that prayer. Because the next morning, when Dad did go, one of my first words when I closed my eyes was thank you. Which goes against everything that you're taught. You're supposed to preach healing into them, and I wasn't. I was relieved. It was over. He was at peace. He didn't have to suffer through it anymore. And I think that's okay. Another story about my dad. My dad was never a really big religious man. He believed there was a God. Going to church was not his forte. He'd go from time to time, but not his favorite thing to do in the world. My dad's sense of humor, on the other hand, was something else, which is something I've been blessed or cursed with, depending on how you want to look at it. My father was very stubborn. I get a lot of that from him. I remember there's a story. My father was at his friend Stan's. If I remember right, that's how the story goes. My dad woke up and couldn't move his entire left side. My father waved it off as a cramp, and it will pass. Stan, of course, tried several times to get my dad to go to the hospital, which my father outright refused. Until, of course, the Achilles heel of my father was used, which was calling my mother. And once my mother informed my dad that he was going to the hospital either in her trunk or by ambulance, my father chose the latter. And we found out that his cramp was a stroke. Yeah. Luckily, my dad feared my mother more than he feared anything else. I might have a few points of that story off, but that's how I remember it. That happened a couple of times. My father stopped telling my mother when he had doctor's appointments because my mother had this nasty habit of making sure he went. I may or may not have got that gene. Another thing about my dad was he would give his shirt off his back for anybody. Anybody. Even friends he knew that were never going to take his advice. He'd give it anyway. And then sit back and watch them not do what he told them to do. And he wouldn't judge them. He'd just take them in, dust them off, send them out again. Dad's friend Martin could attest to that one. My dad was loyal to a fault. He was loyal to my mother. No, they had a divorce. My dad was loyal to a fault. My mother ever needed anything, my dad got it. Never expected anything back. Hell, I was spoiled rotten. But I think it's important that when you remember somebody, remember the good times, but you remember the bad times too. Because we often find the character of somebody at the worst times, at the best times. And my father, it didn't matter. Hell, fire, brimstone. My dad would find a way. Always. Didn't matter. There would always be a way to find it. There'd always be a way to get through to the next payday. There'd be always another way to get something done. Wheel, deal, hook by crook. Dad would get it done. I kind of picked up some of that from him. Arthur Frederick Knowles left this world 19 years ago. This Monday, 25th. And the hole that he left will never really be filled. My dad did so much for so many people with so little. Did so much for me. I didn't even realize half of it until I was much older. Especially when I was raising my kids. I'd pause every once in a while and go, my dad said that to me. I'm saying it to them. Oh, joy. But my dad is a man, was strong, but he had his soft side when he needed it. Just didn't show it very much. And by that, I don't mean that he didn't show love and affection. I just mean that my dad was very reserved. Dad could be in enormous amounts of pain and you'd barely know it if you were sitting at the table with him. There are countless stories. My dad was the ultimate people pleaser to a degree. He'd know that they needed to sit there and talk to him, and dad was in pain or dad was tired. Dad wanted to go lay down, but dad was too polite to go, would you please bugger off? It happened more times than I'd like to count. My dad was also very stubborn, as I've said over and over again. And please do forgive me for rambling. If y'all make it to the end of this video, I'll be surprised. There was many good times with my dad. My dad always knew when to make a joke. Being in the hospital with my dad was always entertaining. Sometimes dad went a little too far, but memories I'll never be able to forget. My dad deciding to crack a joke when a female nurse bent over in his room and he asked her to bend over a little bit further, he might know her. Things like that. And you're sitting there going, oh, how do I crawl underneath this hospital bed so that people don't see that I'm here? And he got a royal kick out of it because he wouldn't say it quietly. He said it as loud and proud as he could. My dad's rule was once he hit 64, he was allowed to say whatever he wanted. At 65, he no longer had to apologize for it. And he stuck to that rule more often than not. But at the same time, my dad would shelter someone. My dad would feed someone. My dad would be there for somebody if they needed it. Dad had an open couch policy for the most part, unless you really pissed him off, and that was hard to do. Really hard to do. For the most part, Dad was there, always. And growing up with my dad was really interesting because he wasn't one of those fathers that tells you what you're supposed to do, and then if you don't do it, gets mad at you for not doing it. My dad was more along the lines of, here's what I think you should do. And then you look at your dad and go, yeah, no, I'm going to do it this way because I think it's better. And once dad was done explaining that, no, that's not the best course of action, and you still decide to go ahead with it, once you made that decision, his opinion didn't matter anymore. He'd support you all the way. Didn't matter. Didn't matter if he agreed with it. Didn't matter if he thought it was the right thing to do. Once you had made that decision and you told him why, he went, okay, let's do it. And I never realized just how special that was till later in life. Just that simple thing. Once you'd made that decision, once you chose to do that, it was okay, let's do it. My dad did many things for me and put up with a lot of shit. Oh my God. I was not the ideal child. Definitely not. But he never wavered. Even when I thought he had, he really hadn't. He always knew when to make me laugh. He always knew when to give me a kick in the ass. And he knew when to use either one. Sometimes both. Good story. I just got my driver's license. And my full license was first time taking the dad out for a drive. So, of course, I'm minding my P's and Q's and driving correctly. And we're out on the perimeter highway here in Winnipeg, just on the outskirts. We're going around the perimeter. And there's this Mustang that is beside us. And it's probably got a V6 at best. I've got a V8. And every light, this idiot is over revving his engine because he's got chicks in the car and he's trying to look special. And we get to the third light. And my father looks over at me and he says, "Is there something wrong with the car that I don't know about?" And I said, "No, Dad, the car's fine. I just took it in a little while ago. It got serviced." He says, "Okay. So explain to me why that piece of junk is still beside us." And of course, being the son that I am, I'm like, "Well, I'm just driving calmly, Dad." He says, if you don't blow the doors off that damn car, it's time for you to turn in your license." So, with that said, light turned green and I blew the doors off the Mustang, as directed by my father. Yeah. Here I am trying to be all Mr. Perfect and, want to show Dad that I can drive cautiously. And, well, Dad got sick and tired of that real quick and just looked at me and said, "Why is that Mustang still beside us? Blow the doors off of it, please." And I did. Not really recklessly. I just put my foot to the floor and opened up the V8. Well, that was that. But Dad did that a lot. Just little things of, don't hide things. Don't as he put it, I'd rather know so I can protect you than you hide it and we find out, other ways. I've kind of done that with my kids now. I'd rather know. I kind of get his point now. Didn't back then. Blew me away why my dad would be so accepting of things and stuff like that. But as a father now, I get it. There's a lot of things my dad did I get now that I didn't then. My dad also taught me a lot of life lessons. I'll leave with this one because this is about the most important thing. One of the bigger ones my dad did. So I'm not going to get too much into it, but after my mother died, I held a lot of ill will, whether it was right or wrong. That's debatable. I held a lot of ill will towards my grandmother. A lot. Right or wrong. Probably more wrong than right, looking back. And before Dad died, a couple years before Dad died, we took a trip to see my grandmother. And Dad set me aside. And he's like, "Enough is enough. You're going to go in that room and you're going to hug your grandmother and you're going to fucking mean it." And at first I looked at my dad and I couldn't understand. We weren't at my grandmother's. We were on our way. And Dad just said, "Look, in life, we all do things we think is right, whether we're right or we're wrong. At the time, it was the best option we had in our minds. And who knows? One day you may have the same problem. We all make mistakes. You holding on to it ain't doing shit for you. Let it go. And so when I got to my grandmother's and I hugged my grandmother, it was the first time in a very long time that I had hugged my grandmother and meant it. No ill will, no, I'm doing this just because I have to do this. And I never brought it up with my grandmother. Never. Not to her dying day. But it was my father that helped me get through that. And he was right. He was 100% right. He was more right that day than any other day I could think of. And it led to many more visits with my grandmother. My oldest two got to see her. And it was great not having that weight on my shoulders. It didn't need to be big drama. Nobody needed to know. No one that needed to know was me. I'd let it go. So if you have somebody that may have made the wrong choice, sometimes it's just easier to let go. Just as my dad said, holding it doesn't do shit for you. Really doesn't. So, cheers, Pop. I love you. I always will. And I hope that one day, when I get up there, all I want to know is, you did good, my boy. If I can get that when my days are done, then it doesn't matter what anybody thinks of me down here. Doesn't matter a bit. Could give a rat's ass. As long as when my days are done, he looks at me and says, you did okay. With that thought, take her easy, folks.